The tapestry hangs in silence. Gold thread catches the morning light filtering through stone. Woven figures ride in eternal procession. Lances raised, banners bright, faces carved into expressions of divine purpose. This is how we remember them. Knights, warriors of God, protectors of the weak, men bound by oaths that transformed violence into virtue. But step closer. The tapestry frays at the edges. The gold thread tarnishes. And beneath the woven surface, another story waits. One written not in silk, but in blood and ash and the screams of burning villages. In the year 1209, the town of Bzirs burns. Smoke rises in columns that stain the summer sky. Inside the cathedral, families huddle together, Catholic and Cathar alike. Children pressed against their mothers' skirts, old men clutching rosaries with trembling fingers. They believed the stone walls would save them. They believed in sanctuary. They believed wrong. The knights come in steel and surcoats marked with crosses. They are crusaders, holy warriors. The Pope himself blessed their swords. When someone asks how to distinguish the heretics from the faithful, the answer comes swift and cold: kill them all. God will know his own. The doors splinter. The screaming begins. And when the flames finally consume the last timber, 7,000 bodies lie cooling in the ash. The knights ride away with loaded wagons. Not conquerors. Not heroes. Butchers in blessed armor. This is the truth the tapestries do not show. This is the reality that centuries of legend have buried beneath layers of romance and fantasy. We have been told stories of Camelot and courtly love, of noble warriors who lived by codes of honor, who fought only for justice, who treated women with reverence and enemies with mercy. We have been fed myth until we mistake it for history. But history remembers differently. History remembers the villages razed for sport, the peasants trampled beneath war horses for refusing to yield their grain, the ransoms that bankrupted kingdoms, the tournaments where men died choking on their own blood while ladies applauded from silk pavilions, the marriages consummated through rape sanctioned by law and church, the crusades that butchered Christians and Muslims with equal enthusiasm, all in the name of a God who commanded love. The medieval knight was not a fairy tale. He was a weapon, a tool of violence wielded by kings and lords to extract wealth, enforce submission, and expand territory through terror. The armor was real. The swords were real. But the chivalry? The honor? The noble purpose? Those were stories told by the victors, written by poets paid in silver, sung by minstrels who knew which side of the blade kept them breathing. 7 myths have shaped our understanding of these men. 7 lies that historians have spent lifetimes trying to correct, only to watch Hollywood and fantasy novels breathe new life into old falsehoods. These myths are not harmless. They sanitize brutality. They romanticize oppression. They teach us to admire systems of violence by dressing them in velvet and calling them virtue. Tonight, we burn the tapestry. We peel back the gold thread and examine what lies beneath. We walk through the villages that do not appear in songs. We listen to the voices that chronicles dismissed as unworthy of record. We see the knight not as legend imagined him, but as history reveals him, complex, brutal, human, and far more terrible than any dragon in any tale. The myth served its purpose once. It justified power. It made violence holy. It transformed theft into taxation and murder into justice. But we do not live in that world anymore. We have no need for their lies. Let us begin with the first and greatest deception, the one that built all the others. The myth of chivalry itself. The word sounds like silk. Chivalry. It rolls off the tongue, carrying images of courtesy and grace, of knights who bow before ladies and spare defeated foes, of warriors whose strength is tempered by mercy. This is the central pillar of the knightly myth, that these men were bound by a code that elevated them above common soldiers, that made their violence righteous and their power benevolent. The reality begins in a French manor in 1182. A knight named Bertrand de Born sits composing verse. He is educated, cultured, a poet whose words will survive centuries. Listen to what he writes. I love the joyous season of spring. But I love even more the sights and sounds of war. I love to see peasants fleeing with their goods, their tents burning. I love to see castles besieged, walls crumbling, warriors on horseback with lances driving through flesh. This is chivalry speaking. Not in the sanitized versions we inherit, but in its own voice, unashamed. Bertrand de Born was not an outlier. He was celebrated. His poetry circulated through noble courts. Other knights nodded in recognition at his words because they understood the truth. Chivalry was never about protecting the weak. It was about regulating violence among equals while permitting unlimited brutality toward everyone else. The codes existed. They were real. But read them carefully. The Code of Chivalry is recorded in various sources throughout medieval Europe, focused on specific obligations: loyalty to one's lord, courage in battle, generosity to other nobles, courtesy to highborn ladies. Notice what is absent: any mention of peasants, any protection for the poor, any restriction on the burning of villages or the slaughter of non-combatants. Because chivalry was a class system dressed as morality. It extended only to those who mattered. Other knights, nobility, the church hierarchy. Everyone else was livestock. Useful for labor, valuable for ransom, expendable when convenient. In 1356, during the 100 Years' War, English knights under the Black Prince conduct a chevauche through southern France. The term sounds technical. The reality is terrorism. They spend weeks moving through the countryside, systematically destroying everything. Crops burned, livestock slaughtered, villages razed, civilians murdered or left to starve. This is not war. No armies engage. No territory is held. This is economic warfare designed to cripple the enemy by destroying the people who feed his armies. The knights who participate are not criminals. They are not court-martialed or punished. They are celebrated. The Black Prince himself is remembered as one of the great chivalric figures of his age. His coat of arms hangs in Canterbury Cathedral. His tomb receives flowers from admirers who know nothing of the screaming. Or consider tournaments, the ultimate expression of knightly culture. We imagine pageantry and controlled combat. The reality was a blood sport where knights competed for ransoms by battering each other unconscious and demanding payment for release. Hundreds died in these games. Not just knights, but the servants and peasants trampled when armored cavalry charged through crowds. The church repeatedly tried to ban tournaments. The reason was not moral concern for violence, but frustration that knights were killing each other before they could be shipped off to crusades. And when war called, chivalry revealed its truest face. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, English knights stood victorious over French prisoners. Hundreds of captured nobles knelt in the mud, unarmed, awaiting ransom negotiations as the code demanded. Then, word came of a French counterattack. Henry V gave the order, kill them all. The prisoners were butchered where they knelt, not by common soldiers, but by knights who understood that pragmatism trumped honor when survival was at stake. Some chroniclers expressed discomfort with this act, but Henry faced no consequences. He remained a hero. Because everyone understood the unwritten truth, chivalry was a luxury, observed when convenient, discarded when necessary. It was performance, not principle. A story knights told about themselves to distinguish their violence from the vulgar brutality of common men. The peasant who killed for bread was a murderer. The knight who killed for land was a warrior. The difference was not in the act, but in who wielded the blade. Chivalry sanctified that distinction. It transformed class privilege into moral superiority. It allowed knights to commit atrocities while believing themselves righteous. This was its purpose. This was its function. Not to restrain violence, but to justify it. Not to protect the weak, but to ensure the strong could brutalize them without shame. The code of chivalry was not a failure to live up to high ideals. It succeeded perfectly at its actual goal, maintaining a social order built on sanctified brutality. The ballads sing of single combat. Knight faces knight on the field of honor. They fight fairly, weapon to weapon, skill against skill. The defeated warrior yields. The victor spares him, accepting ransom as custom demands. This is how honor looks in song. This is the lie that makes war seem noble. The truth begins in mud. The Battle of Crecy, 1346. French knights charge uphill through ground churned to sucking clay by rain. They are the flower of chivalry, mounted, armored, trained since childhood in warfare. They expect to meet English knights in proper combat. Instead, they meet arrows. English longbowmen stand in formation, shooting not at individual targets but at massed cavalry. They fire 12 arrows per minute. The math is simple and terrible. Thousands of shafts darken the sky. Horses scream and tumble. Knights crash to the ground, trapped in armor that turns them into helpless beetles on their backs. The archers walk forward with knives and hammers. They find the gaps in the armor. They kill methodically, efficiently, without ceremony. This is not honor. This is slaughter. But it is also victory, which matters more than any code. The English knights present did not object to this vulgar tactic. They celebrated it, because honor in combat was always flexible, always contingent, always subordinate to winning. Consider ransom, supposedly the civilized heart of knightly warfare. A captured knight would be treated well, held comfortably, returned to his family upon payment. This sounds merciful until you understand the system. Ransom was business. Knights captured enemies not from compassion but from greed. A dead knight generated nothing. A living one might be worth thousands of gold coins. After the Battle of Poitiers in 1356, French King John II was captured. His ransom was set at 3 million gold crowns, a sum so vast it crippled the French economy for decades. Taxes crushed the peasantry to raise the payment. Villages starved. But the code was observed. The king was treated with respect, housed comfortably in England, allowed to hunt and feast while his people bled silver to buy him back. This is honor as practiced by knights, a system that protected the wealthy by turning warfare into a business transaction while the poor paid the price. The peasant conscript who died on the field received no ransom negotiation, no comfortable captivity. He was cut down and left to rot because his life held no economic value. And when prisoners became inconvenient, honor evaporated. During the Crusades, Saladin executed Templar and Hospitaller knights after battles specifically because their religious orders forbade paying ransom. They were worth nothing alive and dangerous to keep as prisoners. Saladin was not considered dishonorable. He was considered pragmatic. Knights understood this logic because they practiced it themselves whenever economics dictated. The Treaty of Calais in 1347 tells another story. After a siege that lasted nearly a year, the English King Edward III agreed to spare the city if 6 leading citizens would surrender themselves for execution. 6 men walked out in nooses, ready to die to save their neighbors. Edward's queen begged for mercy. The king relented, sparing them. Historians record this as an example of chivalric magnanimity. But consider what it reveals. Edward was fully prepared to execute surrendered civilians to make a point. Only the intervention of his wife prevented it. This was normal. This was expected. The honor code that supposedly governed knightly behavior placed no restriction on the slaughter of commoners. They existed outside the system entirely. Even in single combat, the iconic image of knightly honor, reality, was darker. Judicial duels were fought to settle disputes, yes, but they were also spectacles where knights could demonstrate prowess while legally murdering rivals. The rules specified weapons and armor, but made no provision for fairness in wealth or training. A poor knight facing a rich one fought at disadvantage in every way that mattered. Inferior equipment, less training, fewer resources for preparation. Honor meant different things to different classes. For knights, it meant reputation among equals. For peasants, it meant nothing at all. A knight who murdered a peasant faced no dishonor unless he did it clumsily or without justification recognizable to other nobles. But a peasant who raised a hand against a knight, even in self-defense, committed a crime punishable by death. The battlefield was not a tournament ground. It was a killing floor. Knights used every advantage available: terrain, numbers, weather, surprise, deception. They employed common soldiers to do the dying while preserving themselves for ransom value. They targeted supply lines and civilians because starving an enemy into submission was faster than fighting. They showed mercy only when profit or politics demanded it. This was not dishonor. This was warfare, stripped of pretense. The code of honor existed not to govern actual behavior, but to provide a vocabulary for justifying whatever actions served victory. Honor was the story told afterward, when the screaming stopped and the chroniclers arrived to record what the survivors wanted remembered. The knight kneels in the chapel. Candlelight flickers across his bowed head. The priest blesses his sword, speaking Latin words that transform steel into sacred instrument. The knight rises bearing the cross on his surcoat. He is now a soldier of God. His violence sanctified. His cause righteous. His victims deserving of their fate. This image, the Christian warrior fighting for faith, sits at the heart of knightly mythology. We are taught that knights defended Christendom against infidels, that they spread the gospel with one hand while wielding the sword with the other, that their faith made them merciful and their piety made them just. The reality begins on July 15th, 1099, in Jerusalem. Crusader knights breach the walls after a long siege. They pour into the city carrying crosses and singing hymns. What follows is not conversion. It is extermination. They slaughter Muslims in the streets. They burn Jews alive in synagogues. They wade through blood that chroniclers describe as reaching ankle deep in places. They kill for 3 days without pause. One crusader, Raymond of Aguilares, writes proudly of the scene, "Men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins." Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. This is religious purity speaking, not in metaphor, but in action. The knights who participated were not rogue criminals. They were celebrated heroes. The church proclaimed their victory a miracle. Poets sang of their valor. They returned home to honors and lands, their reputations enhanced by the slaughter they committed in Christ's name. Or consider the Albigensian Crusade, which opened this script. In 1209, Pope Innocent III proclaimed a holy war not against distant Muslims, but against Christian heretics in southern France. The Cathars believed differently about the nature of God and salvation. For this theological disagreement, the Pope promised crusaders the same spiritual rewards as fighting in Jerusalem: complete forgiveness of sins, seized property, and eternal salvation. Knights flocked to the cause, not from religious fervor alone, but because heretic land was now legal plunder. For 20 years, they ravaged southern France with a brutality that shocked even medieval observers. At Bziers, they killed Catholics alongside Cathars. At Marmande, they slaughtered every person in the city, including infants. At Montsker, they burned 200 Cathars alive in a single pyre. These were knights, Christian warriors, men who attended Mass and took communion and believed themselves righteous. Their faith did not restrain their violence. It unleashed it. It provided justification for atrocities that might otherwise trouble a conscience. The cross on their surcoat transformed murder into holy service. Even in regions not touched by crusades, knightly piety revealed its nature. Knights endowed monasteries and churches generously, funding elaborate buildings and religious art. But examine the source of their wealth. It came from extraction, taxes forced from peasants, plunder taken in war, ransoms extorted from prisoners. The gold that gilded altar crosses was stained with the suffering of those who could not refuse to pay. The medieval church and knighthood existed in symbiosis. Knights protected church property and enforced ecclesiastical authority. In return, the church sanctified knightly violence, providing theological frameworks that made brutality sacred. The truce of God forbade warfare on certain holy days, not to end violence, but to regulate it. Knights could still murder and pillage, just not on Sundays or feast days. Consider the military orders: Templars, Hospitallers. Teutonic Knights. These were monks and warriors combined, men who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience while simultaneously training to kill with maximum efficiency. They represented the ultimate fusion of piety and violence. They prayed before battle and after. But during, they slaughtered with the same enthusiasm as any secular knight, believing their victims were enemies of God who deserved no mercy. The Teutonic Knights campaigns in the Baltic regions exemplify this perfectly. They invaded pagan lands under the guise of converting the heathen. What they actually did was conquer territory, enslave populations, and establish a brutal theocratic state. Conversion happened at sword point or not at all. The knights built churches over demolished sacred groves and forced baptisms on populations who understood nothing of the faith being thrust upon them. This was Christian knighthood in practice. Not spreading the gospel, but expanding power. Not saving souls, but acquiring land. The religious language was genuine. Knights truly believed they served God. But their belief did not make their actions merciful. It made them merciless, because they had convinced themselves that cruelty in God's name was virtue. The myth tells us that faith civilized the knight, that Christianity tempered his warrior nature with compassion. The truth inverts this completely. Christianity provided the knight with the ultimate justification for violence. It transformed him from a mere killer into a holy warrior. It allowed him to commit atrocities without shame, to burn and slaughter and conquer while believing himself righteous. The cross on the surcoat did not restrain the sword arm. It blessed it. The castle rises from the hill like a natural formation, stone growing from stone. Inside, a boy learns to be a knight. He is 7 years old, sent from his father's house to serve as a page. He will learn Latin, courtly manners, the names of virtues. He will be shaped into nobility. This is the story, that knights were born to superiority, that their blood carried virtues the common could never possess, that their education refined them into paragons of civilization. The reality is written in account books and charters, in records historians piece together from fragments. The majority of knights were not princes from fairy tales. They were minor landholders, younger sons of impoverished families, men desperate for the only career that offered advancement through violence. Many could barely read. Most understood Latin only as liturgical sound, syllables repeated without comprehension. Their nobility was recent, purchased, or fabricated entirely. In 1216, England's King John needed soldiers. He created knights by the dozens. Any man who held land worth 20 pounds annually could be compelled to accept knighthood and its military obligations. This was not honor. It was conscription dressed in ceremony. Many landholders tried to avoid the distinction because knighthood meant expenses they could not afford. The armor, the horses, the equipment required to campaign, these costs bankrupted families. Knights were not wealthy elites. Many were rural thugs with inherited weapons and delusions of grandeur. Consider William Marshall, often celebrated as the greatest knight of the medieval age. He was born a younger son, entitled to nothing. He earned his fortune through tournaments, fighting dozens of combats where he captured and ransomed opponents. He married wealth late in life, gaining lands and title through political maneuvering. His biographer depicts him as the embodiment of chivalric virtue. But read carefully. His virtue consisted of loyalty to whichever patron paid him, skill at violence, and ruthless pragmatism in accumulating power. Marshall was exceptional in his success, not his origins or methods. Countless knights followed the same path with less fortune, fighting for pay, switching allegiances when advantageous, surviving through brutality and opportunism. These were not educated philosophers. They were professional killers attempting to climb a social ladder built on the bodies of those below. The education of knights reveals more myth than substance. Yes, noble sons were sent to other households as pages and squires, but their training focused overwhelmingly on martial skills, riding, weapons, hunting. The courtly refinement existed, but primarily for those destined for court. A minor knight defending a remote castle had little use for poetry or philosophy. He needed to know how to extract taxes from resistant peasants. how to intimidate rivals, how to survive in a world where violence was the primary language of power. Many knights were illiterate. They signed documents with marks or seals because they could not write their own names. The romantic image of the knight reading romances to his lady collapses when confronted with the reality that most knights could not read at all. The literary culture we associate with knighthood belonged to a tiny elite: court poets, educated clergy, wealthy nobles who could afford tutors. The average knight was a rough man who lived rough, understood force, and cared little for abstractions. Criminal records paint another picture. Knights appeared frequently in medieval court documents, accused of assault, rape, theft, murder. Their status often protected them from serious consequences. A knight who raped a peasant woman might face fine or penance, not execution. A knight who murdered a rival in a property dispute could claim self-defense or pay compensation to the victim's family. Noble birth did not prevent crime. It granted immunity from proportional punishment. The idea that nobility conferred virtue was propaganda, necessary to maintain social hierarchy. If knights were merely men with weapons, their authority became questionable. But if they were born superior, bred for leadership, naturally inclined toward justice and mercy, then the system made sense. Their violence became order. Their authority became natural law. Genealogies were fabricated or exaggerated constantly. Families claimed descent from Charlemagne or Roman emperors on evidence that was thin or invented. These false lineages served a purpose. They transformed recent privilege into ancient right. A family that gained knighthood 3 generations ago through luck or brutality could claim instead that their nobility stretched back to the Caesars, that their blood had always been destined to rule. Even genuinely old noble families produced sons who were vicious, stupid, cruel, incompetent. Birth guaranteed nothing except opportunity. Some knights were intelligent, capable leaders. Others were barely functional thugs who inherited positions they could not adequately fill. The medieval world had no meritocracy. A fool born to knighthood remained a knight. A genius born a peasant remained a peasant. The virtue of nobility was performance, maintained through careful management of reputation and ruthless suppression of truth. Knights who committed atrocities had their deeds reframed by friendly chroniclers as necessary harshness or unfortunate but justified responses. Knights who showed cowardice had their retreats described as tactical withdrawals. The historical record itself was shaped by those who benefited from the myth. Noble birth meant access to weapons and training. Nothing more. It did not confer wisdom, courage, honor, or virtue. It simply placed a man in a position where he could commit violence with social sanction. Some knights were decent men despite their class. Many were not. Their blood did not make them better. It merely made them dangerous. The troubadour sings in the great hall. His words paint pictures of a knight who loves a lady from afar, whose devotion ennobles him, who performs great deeds in her honor. She is married to another, untouchable, perfect. He loves without hope of consummation. His longing purifies him. This is courtly love, the romantic heart of medieval fantasy, the relationship that supposedly civilized the brutal knight and elevated women to pedestals of veneration. The reality begins with a legal document, a marriage contract from 1271 in Normandy. The bride is 13. The groom is 47. Her father negotiated the alliance to secure a military partnership. She had no say. She will be delivered to a stranger's bed, legally obligated to submit to intercourse regardless of her will. If she resists, the church and law both support her husband's right to force compliance. This is not romance. This is sanctioned rape dressed in ceremony. Medieval marriage among nobility was real estate transaction. Women were property transferred between men, from father to husband, carrying with them lands, alliances, political advantages. The poetry of courtly love emerged not to challenge this system, but to function within it. Knights wrote verses to ladies they could not possess legally because those ladies belonged to other men. The longing was safe precisely because it was unconsummatable. It posed no threat to the actual structure of ownership. But examine what happened outside the poetry. Knights held absolute legal authority over their wives. They could beat them without consequence. The law explicitly permitted a husband to correct his wife physically as long as he didn't kill her. They could rape them. The concept of marital rape did not exist. A wife's body was her husband's property by law and religious doctrine. She could refuse nothing. The church's teaching was explicit. Women were inherently sinful, daughters of Eve, whose weakness brought damnation into the world. They required male authority to govern their inferior natures. Marriage was not partnership, but hierarchy, with the husband as head and the wife as subordinate body. When knights treated their wives with affection, it was mercy, not obligation. When they treated them with brutality, it was their right. Consider tournaments again, those supposed celebrations of courtly culture where knights fought to impress ladies. Women attended as decoration, prizes, symbols of status. The queen of the tournament might bestow a favor on a champion, a scarf or sleeve to wear as token. But she had no choice in the matter. Her role was ceremonial. Her presence used to sanctify male violence with feminine approval. She could watch men destroy each other and applaud appropriately, or face social condemnation for failing to perform her designated part. The dark truth emerges starkly in court records and chronicles. Knights raped peasant women with impunity. These were not crimes in any meaningful sense. A peasant woman's testimony against a knight was worthless in court. Even if witnesses existed, the penalty was minimal, a fine paid to the woman's father or husband for damage to their property. The woman herself had no legal standing to seek justice. Even noble women were not safe. Political marriages were often enforced through violence. A reluctant bride might be beaten into submission. A widow who refused remarriage could be abducted and forcibly wed to secure her lands. The church occasionally objected to the most egregious cases, but canon law provided limited protection and enforcement was inconsistent. The cult of the Virgin Mary ran parallel to courtly love, teaching that women achieved virtue through impossible standards, virginity and motherhood simultaneously. Real women could never satisfy this contradiction. They were either virgins, valuable as unused property, or wives and mothers valued for producing heirs. Their personhood was irrelevant. Their desires, fears, intelligence, ambition, these mattered only insofar as they affected the men who owned them. Literary evidence reveals the fantasy more than reality. The Romance of the Rose, one of the most popular medieval texts, depicts love as a hunt, with the male lover besieging the female beloved like a castle to be conquered. The language is explicitly military. The woman resists. The man deploys strategies to overcome her defenses. When he succeeds, and the narrative ensures he does, this is presented as victory, romance, natural order. Modern readers recognize this as a description of predatory behavior. Medieval audiences read it as instruction manual. Some noble women wielded power, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Blanche of Castile, others who ruled as regents or in their own right. But their exceptionalism proves the rule. They succeeded by transcending their gender, by ruling as men did, with the same ruthlessness and political cunning. They were not celebrated for feminine virtue but masculine capability, and even they remained subject to constraints no nobleman faced. The troubadour sang of unrequited love because requited love was boring. It was marriage, duty, childbearing, submission. The poetry existed as escapism for both genders, a fantasy that reimagined the brutal transactional reality of noble marriage as something transcendent. But it changed nothing material. The same knight who wept over verses praising his lady's beauty went home and exercised absolute authority over his wife's body, property, and life. Courtly love did not elevate women. It created an aesthetic that made their subjugation romantic. It taught that women should be grateful for pedestals, even when those pedestals were cages. It told men they honored women by worshiping them from afar, while granting them legal and physical authority to dominate the women they actually possessed. The poetry was beautiful. The reality was brutal. And the myth served its purpose perfectly, making oppression look like reverence, making ownership look like devotion, making a system of patriarchal violence look like the highest form of love. The tapestry burns now. Watch the flames consume gold thread and woven lies. The smoke rises bitter and dark, carrying away centuries of careful mythology. What remains when the images blacken and curl is not emptiness, but truth, harder, sharper, more complex than any comfortable fantasy. We cling to these myths for reasons that should make us uncomfortable. The knight represents a seductive fantasy, that violence can be noble, that power can be virtuous, that a system built on oppression can be justified by the character of those who benefit from it. We want to believe that brutality can be beautiful if only the right people commit it with the right intentions. But history offers no such comfort. The medieval knight was a product of his time, a time of staggering inequality, casual cruelty, and systems designed to concentrate power in the hands of those willing to maintain it through force. Some knights were decent men within that system. Many were not. But the system itself was not decent, and participating in it required accepting its fundamental premise that some human beings were born to rule and others born to serve, and that violence was the proper tool for maintaining that distinction. The myths persist because we inherited the cultural products of the victors. The songs and stories and romances were created by and for the noble class, reflecting their values, justifying their power, sanitizing their violence. The peasants who comprised 90% of medieval society left far fewer records. Their stories were not written down, their perspectives not preserved. History, as we received it, is the version the powerful wanted remembered. Modern medievalism in fantasy literature and film perpetuates these myths with enthusiasm. We are given Camelot without the corpses, jousts without the poverty that funded them, knights in shining armor without the blood caked in the metal's joints. These fantasies are not harmless entertainment. They teach us to admire aristocratic violence. They make feudalism look appealing. They train us to accept that some people deserve power over others based on birth or strength. The truth is not that medieval knights were uniformly evil. Individuals varied. Some showed genuine courage, mercy, compassion. But the institution of knighthood was a mechanism of oppression, and participating in it meant benefiting from that oppression. The knight's honor was built on the peasant's suffering. His glory was purchased with others' blood. Understanding this history matters because power structures endure long after their obvious forms disappear. We no longer have knights, but we have myths about warriors, about violence as purifying, about hierarchies as natural. We are still told stories that make brutality beautiful when the right people commit it. We still romanticize systems that concentrated power and justified inequality. The medieval knight teaches us something valuable, but not what the myths intended. He teaches us that good people can participate in evil systems while believing themselves righteous. That education and culture do not prevent cruelty. That sincerely held religious belief can justify atrocity. That love and brutality can coexist in the same person. That systems of power protect themselves through stories that make oppression look like order. We do not need to hate the individual knights who lived centuries ago. We need to see clearly what they were, stripped of romance. We need to recognize the myths for what they are, propaganda that served its purpose then and continues to mislead us now. And we need to ask what myths we believe today, what systems we participate in, what brutalities we excuse, because the stories we tell ourselves make them seem necessary or noble or justified. The tapestry is ash now. The gold thread is gone. What remains is human, complex, contradictory, capable of both beauty and horror. The medieval knight was not a hero or a villain from a simple tale. He was a person embedded in a system that valued his life above others, that granted him power over others' bodies and fates, that taught him violence was virtue when practiced in service of the right masters. History does not give us heroes. It gives us people making choices within constraints we can analyze and understand. The medieval knight made his choices. We must make ours, knowing what we now know, seeing clearly what we once saw through the filter of myth. The flames die, the ashes cool, and in the morning light, truth stands bare and undeniable. waiting for those with courage to look.